I got cut off once again, but we're just going to keep going on. So the Zimmermann Telegraph, what does it do? Basically, this is a letter between Germany and Mexico, our southern neighbor, and this is what it says. We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together. Generous financial support and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform the president of the president of Mexico, by the way, the president of the above most secretly, as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. Please call the President's attention to the fact that the ruthless employment of our submarines now offers the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace. Signed, Zimmermann. Zimmermann's actually a German member of the government, and he basically realizes that if they can make it so that America has to fight on its own continent, they can't bring a bunch of troops to fight in Europe. And so they basically try to make a deal with Mexico. Now, some people have argued that this was a hoax and this never happened. We've actually found declassified German documents. This was real. The Germans were really trying to get the Mexicans to attack the Americans. And the reason for this was, just like I said, is to keep them out of the wars, to keep the Americans out of the war in Europe, because they knew that once the Americans get involved, that might be it for the Germans. And they were right, actually. That's one of the things that's going to be the deciding turning points of World War I. And we're going to see that in a minute. But something interesting happens because America is sort of divided. Many people are all on board with the anti-German rhetoric. They say, look at the Lusitania. They say, look at the Zimmermann Telegraph. The Germans are doing war crimes. They're doing these terrible things. They're trying to hit us in our own backyard. We have to attack them. We have to attack them in full force, and we have to do it now. Another larger group of Americans said that's a European problem. If they want to fight with all of that, that's their deal. But why should we be involved? We don't necessarily have a dog in this fight. Why do we have to send Americans to go die in Europe in order to do this? And that was a big issue because one of the things that happens is when America initially declares war, they do not have a draft. They initially basically have it signed up as you get to sign up however you want. You can go to your selection board, but they get a paltry number of people that sign up. They get about 300,000 people that sign up, which sounds like a lot of people. But if you remember what I mentioned about how large the battles are, in the Battle of the Marne and the Battle of the Somme, 1 million people die. So Americans are offering less than a third of the people who died in one battle. That's not a lot. And so what ends up happening is the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, basically says, well, we're not going to be able to do this unless we have a draft. And this is going to mark a new way that countries wage war. And that's really changing the rules of war, changing the way that war works, and really doing some quite different things in order to do this. So one of the things that Woodrow Wilson does is he puts in the Selective Service Act. This is still in effect. You all the men that are listening to this have a selective service registration card, and basically says that if there ever is a draft, you've got a number. That's essentially what the selective service is. It says it's a draft. That's the best way to put it. And those 3 million people that are chosen, well, now they have to go over and fight in Europe. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, a lot of controversy about this. Many people think that that's illegal, it's unconstitutional. Woodrow Wilson and the Congress say, well, that's too bad. We have to do this. And that's going to be one of the things that we're going to see, is that normally in American politics and in other sort of liberal democracies, there's this idea that there should be a debate about issues, that there should be this modern sort of ongoing debate. But when you're fighting a war, and even a month's sort of delay can make a gigantic difference, well, you don't have time to have it go through Congress. You don't have time to have people vote on it. And so this is when the executive office, which is basically the president, wields a lot more power. And we're going to see that again here. So what are some other things that happen that change the face of modern society? Well, one of the things is the War Industries Board. Basically, it's this idea that if America's going to be fighting a war, well, private consumption is less important than army consumption. Basically, the idea is this: if I'm a company, I have the right to sell whomever I want to. But in the war, we're going to create this industry board, the War Industry Board, that basically says that all of your rubber has to go to gun factories, all of your steel has to go to making planes, or all of your food, the best food, has to go to the soldiers. And that's essentially what the War Industries Board does. It basically subsidizes, which means gives them money for complying. It subsidizes large companies and gives special privileges to certain companies to supply the army. Now imagine if you're a company, right? Imagine if you're a company and your job is to sell shoes, right? And let's say you make boots, army boots. That's what your job is to do. You make army boots for a living. Well, let's imagine for a minute that a war breaks out. You'd say, great, this is awesome. That means that I'm going to be able to sell a lot more shoes. Well, what happens if this War Industry Board comes through and basically makes it so that only one company gets exclusive trading privileges with the army? That's exactly what happened. You're screwed. You don't get the chance to compete. That company that got a special privilege, well, they succeed and you're going to fall apart. This is going to lead to the birth of large corporations. Because often that big corporation that got that special contract from the War Industries Board to supply the soldiers, well, they're just going to buy you. They're going to buy you outright. And what happens, that might be good for you in the short term, but in the long term, what that means, this is the birth of monopolies. This is the birth of large corporations with a huge amount of power. We'll see this more when we get to the late 1900s. Another thing that happens is that it makes it illegal to do what are called seditious acts, basically anything that might threaten the country. Now, this sounds good at first. That actually sounds fine, right? I mean, you don't want to do anything. If you're an American, you don't want to do anything that's going to sort of hurt American interests in the war. Well, who gets to decide what hurts America? It's a very important question because in in both world wars, often they decide, well, if you argue that the draft is a bad thing, that makes you an enemy of America. If you argue that we shouldn't be in the war at all, it means you're an enemy to the war spirit. And what happens is they actually jail people over this, basically for protesting. They make it illegal to protest the war. They often make it illegal to sort of believe that socialism is a good idea. We're going to see that with the Red Scare later. But this leads to larger problems. If America is supposed to be this sort of home of liberty where discussion and free speech is all this great stuff, well, then how can you justify breaking that and making it so that people can't voice their opinions at a time of war? The American government's response is basically, well, these are exceptional times. We don't have to abide by the rules to a T because things are exceptional. Once things are back to normal, we will. But for now, they are exceptional. One of the things that happens is many of these rules remain in effect. They say they're going to take them off the books after the World War is over, but in often cases they don't. And that's going to lead to a lot of problems, particularly in the late 1900s and the early 2000s. Now, I don't want to give you the idea that this is unique to America. These ideas pop up all over the world. French people have this problem of unlimited power of the government. The Germans have the same problem. This is going to lead to a lot of problems later. Now, this is a world war, after all. And I've only been talking about Europe and America so far, and that's doing a disservice, frankly, because there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the First World War that involves a lot of other powers. And a lot of that is colonialism. That's part of the big reason. Remember, we talked the whole class. We've been talking about colonies and empires over abroad, and there's lots of fighting that goes on there. But there's a few really important things that we got to talk about because of what the impacts they're going to have, not only in the next 10 years, but on the next World War. So one of those things is the Ottoman Empire. Now, you can see a map of the Ottoman Empire down here. You can see this is sort of a ethnographic map. And so all this area in green and blue and red was part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire had been pushed out of Europe by this point, so it's sort of on its dying throes. But what happens is the Ottoman Empire is an important trading zone between Europe and Asia. So it was a very important strategic location. And both sides of the fight in the world wars were trying to bring the Ottoman Empire to bear. And one of the things that happens is the Ottoman Empire ends up backing the Germans. And that's really important because they saw the Germans as having the best shot to win. And before the Americans get involved, they're absolutely right, by the way. They're absolutely right. It's the fact that the reason that the World War One ends with a British, American, French, and Russian victory is because Americans bring more people to fight. And it seems sort of indignified, but the main reason they win is because most of the other armies were completely decimated. And here's this new, fresh army that you're just bringing in. Whereas the Ottomans, the German sort of ace in the hole, is not able to field such a large, sort of sophisticated military. So what happens as a result of this? Well, actually a lot of things. What happens is most fighting that the Ottomans do in World War One is against the against the Russian Empire. And as you can see here, Ottomans share a long border. Well, you can't see much of it here, but they share a long border with Russia going to their northeast. And so the Ottomans have been involved in a lot of sort of deadly fighting, sort of really awful abuses on both sides with the Russians. And that's very important because neither side is able to really take a conceded advantage. Well, there's a group of people who live on the border between Russia and the Ottoman Turks that are called the Armenians. And these people had for a long time been petitioning the Ottoman state to be independent. They said, well, many of us are not Muslim. Many of us are Christians. Many of us are ethnically different than the Turkish people. We should have our own state. We should be able to self-determine, and we should be able to do this. They've been saying this since before World War One. Well, World War One rolls around, and there's these rumors that start to spread that the Armenians are actually, now they're siding with the Russians, because the Russians are supposed to be able to kick the Ottomans out, and that would be what the Armenians want. So the Ottoman army starts to get these rumors that the Armenians are basically sabotaging the Ottoman war effort. What ends up happening is the Ottoman army goes into these territories and they slaughter these people. It's a genocide. It's one of the first genocides in the 1900s. Anywhere between 1 and 1.5 million Armenians die violently in this period because they're Armenian and because they're worried that these people are going to be sharing secrets with the enemy. They just murder them. It's a genocide. So that's not the only thing that happens. The Japanese get involved in World War One. We're going to talk about Japan a lot more 30 years from now when we start talking about World War Two. But one of the things that happens is there's lots of colonies in the Pacific Ocean that were owned by Great Britain or France or Germany or in some cases Russia. And what happens is as they're fighting in Europe, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the resources, they don't have the time to go all the way over on the other side of the planet and deal with their little tiny colonies. So what Japan knows is these colonies are ripe for the picking. As Japan starts to conquer these territories, they start to pick up a lot more islands, and this is going to lead to Japanese imperialism in World War II. Because the Japanese are going to invade China in the 1930s as sort of the final cherry on top of their imperialism sundae. And we'll see that in a few lectures. Also, one of the things that people don't often talk about is now many colonies want their own independence. And so I'm talking about colonies of Great Britain and colonies of France or colonies of Spain. And the reason for this is actually quite simple. Well, they said, you say that you're doing these things because you have a superior culture. You say you're doing these things because British culture is the better way to do things. So you say you're doing this because Spanish culture is supposed to be amazing. Well, how amazing is your culture really if you're over there slaughtering each other by the tens of millions? And what happens is many countries start to clamor for independence. India is going to want their independence. South Africa is going to want their independence. All of these countries are going to want to remain independent from what they see as a state and a government system that doesn't work. Because look what World War I does. It's horrific. So the Great War, this is often called the Great War or the war to end all wars. World War I is supposed to be the war that stops war forever. And the reason for this is because it was so horrific. And the idea was that it was so horrific that people would never want to fight again. This is actually going to be one of the things that leads into World War II because they say, well, look at how awful World War I is. No one would want to do this again. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, is going to make that mistake, and we're going to see that in a few lectures. But there's a few main reasons that World War I changes the world. Like we mentioned earlier, this is the First World War. That's a big deal. It's a big deal for people like you and me. Because it used to be that if you weren't a soldier, your life was relatively unimpacted by war. That's not true anymore. Civilians are now considered to be casualties of war, collateral damage. This is going to be a huge deal because it's one thing when people who sign up for money or gold or glory and then they go and die. That's one thing when those people die because it's a lot easier for large populations, and I'm talking about in the Middle Ages. I don't mean about anybody in the modern period. Like, if I'm a mercenary, it's one thing if I die because that's expected. But if I'm a civilian, if I'm a baker and I die in a war, that's a lot harder to stomach. And we're going to see the impacts of that in World War II, in the Vietnam War, and later on when we talk about the Iraq War as well. Also, it doesn't just it's not just military conflicts. It ends up destroying four large empires. Now, the four empires that it destroys here, you won't need to remember exactly verbatim. They're the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German, and the Austro-Hungarian. The two important ones for our story are actually going to be the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire. To a lesser extent, we're going to talk about Russia and the Bolshevik Revolution that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But what happens is when the Ottomans break up, this is very important actually. When the Ottoman Empire breaks up, the British gain much of the territory that they used to control. When the Ottoman Empire was connected and unified, what ended up happening is they're able to keep a lot of the peace between these different groups, these different ethnicities, these different religions. But what happens is Great Britain creates what are known as mandate states. Basically, they say we're not going to colonize the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. We're not going to make true colonies. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to give them guidance. The idea is that these people aren't fit to rule themselves. They look at these places like Iraq, like Syria, like Palestine. They say these places aren't sophisticated enough to rule themselves. We're still going to help them. We're going to send British advisors. We're going to send British think tanks. We're going to help you rule. What ends up really happening is Britain controls much of the Middle East. But think back to what we talked about with the Berlin Conference. This is very important because remember, in the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, the Europeans carve up much of Africa. And the reason they do this is territorial interest. They do this for political reasons. But the important part is they don't look at ethnic boundaries. They don't look at where religious ties are. The Europeans make the same exact mistake in the Middle East. It's going to lead to the creation of states that hate each other because the British basically are interested in political concerns. The other empire that gets destroyed is the German Empire. Remember how we said that the Germans were conquering all that territory in Europe? Well, they have to lose a lot of that territory, and we're going to talk about that big time in that last bullet point here. One of the other things that happens is the United States becomes a world power. The United States was an important industrial power before this, but it's not until after World War I that they become the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. And the reason for this is simple. Because, yes, many Americans die in World War I. I believe the number is between 1 and 2 million American soldiers die. But there's no fighting in America. There's no fighting that ruins American towns. There's no fighting that ruins American homelands. And the reason that America emerges as a world power is simply because they don't need to spend the next 30 years rebuilding, which the French do, which the Russians have to do, which to a lesser extent, the Germans are going to need to do. And that's one of the reasons that America is able to emerge as a world power. Another thing that happens is the Bolshevik Revolution. The reason for this is because stuff in Russia is going really poorly. We're going to see this big time next lecture, but things in Russia are going very bad because Russia loses most of the troops in World War I. Most of the casualties are, they're either Russian or French. And when they lose so many people, they have sort of a debate about what to do. Well, communism is going to come into Russia. And we'll see this all next time. Another thing that happens is it signals an end of European world dominance, and that's kind of what we talked about last time. Colonies aren't as easy to control when they see you murdering your citizens in the tens of millions. And one of the things that's going to happen is the colonial system that brought them so much wealth and power in the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s is about to all break apart. 30 years from now, India is going to be independent, South Africa is going to become independent, and that whole system that the Europeans have created throughout this course is going to fall apart. One of the things we're going to notice in the last few weeks of class is what happens when all of that's all said and done, how that all plays out after everything is finished. But one of the most immediate impacts of World War I is the treaty that ends up being signed at the end of it. And it's called the Treaty of Versailles because of where it's signed. It's signed in the city of Versailles. And this treaty is very important because one of the things that happened is they explicitly put the blame for World War I on the Germans. They say the German expansion was the reason for World War I. They don't go into the details of nationalism, and they don't go into the details of Serbians trying to have their own state, and they don't go into the details of the alliance system. They say it's Germany's fault for World War I. By the way, Germans aren't invited to the Treaty of Versailles peace talks. Basically what happens is the members of the French, American, and British contingent meet in Versailles and they basically have a discussion of how they're going to screw over Germany after the war is over. One of the things that they make them do is they make them pay war reparations. This is a really big problem. War reparations are basically, you have to pay all of the debts we incurred during the war. War reparations makes sense from a cold, calculated perspective. If I get into a war because of you, you should help me pay for it. But what happens is in reality, war reparations force a country that's just been decimated by war because they lost millions of their own soldiers. This forces them in a awful position because now not only do they have to take care of their own business, they have to start paying checks, huge checks, millions of dollars to the other allies that beat them. This is going to lead to directly World War II and the rise of Hitler because the German people are like, we never technically lost, and they're not wrong. The reason that World War I ends is because both sides realize that it's going to end in a American, French, British, and Russian victory because of the Americans coming in. And so Germany ends up reluctantly signing this peace deal because they don't want to fight for another 10 years. It was been horrific. But they don't actually lose many battles in their own country. Many times when people lose a war, it's because their country got invaded and it's decimated and the people don't want to quit. But Germany never lost, is how the Germans feel. That's going to be the thing that's going to lead to resentment. And the Treaty of Versailles is going to be one of the main reasons that Adolf Hitler is going to gain popular support and be elected as one of the most popular presidents and eventually one of the most popular dictators in German history. So we'll cover all that next time. But I hope this was informational for you. It wasn't too hard to stomach. But I hope you have a nice Veterans Day. And again, expect a small quiz on some of the main issues of this when we return. So other than that, have a great time.